Hello everybody. Today I will be talking about the 5 pillars framework of industrial design. It's a framework that I developed over the years of design practice in the field of analyzing and looking at all the different brands in design that we value and respect so much, that always reliably replicate the success in design and create products and experiences that we as the end user really love. So I try to identify what are the fundamentals that are coherent across all the different brands and what is at the core of industrial design in today's world that we as designers potentially want to look at and help to improve our own design work, right? So I will talk about 5 pillars of industrial design. So if you want to find out what these pillars are, you have to stick around. So let's go. First pillar of industrial design is aesthetics. That's the strongest associations that people have with design, right? When you ask or when you tell people that you do design, that they think you make products beautiful and it's all about beauty and appearance and how things look, right? So aesthetics means a set of principles that are concerned with the nature and the appreciation of beauty and also the way that beauty is experienced on all the levels that include all the senses, right? How we see and observe things, how we feel and connect emotionally to those things, how they feel to our skin when we touch them. Like all these things are part of aesthetics, how they sound when we use them. Like, I mean, you get it. All the different senses are part of aesthetics. And aesthetics is the baseline expectation for every industrial designer. Everything an industrial designer has to provide will always be expected to have a aesthetic value, right? So this is also one of the key differentiators to engineers, where the expectation usually is that it's like a highly evolved technical idea that is reliable and technically feasible and according to like all these standards. But what you expect from an industrial designer is that it's beautiful and aesthetic in the first place. And there's a quote by Dieter Rams that is related to aesthetics, right? He said that good design is aesthetic, and it goes on with the aesthetic quality of a product is integral to its usefulness because products we use every day affect our person and our well-being, right? So it really goes beyond just the appearance, the effect that the objects in our surrounding have on us. It's not just that, oh, that we like how they look, but they actually impact our day-to-day life and how we feel about being surrounded by these objects. The key question that we have to ask ourselves when we think about aesthetics is how does it look and how does it feel? How does it make me feel potentially or the user? So we have to think about like the form and the proportions, right? It's all about balance, about shapes, surface transitions. We have to think about colors and materials and lighting also, right? See, part of this is also sketching and composition, right? How to present ideas in a way that is aesthetically valuable and understandable at the same time. This includes product visualization, all the digital renders that you see, styling, right? So if you have already a finished product, how can you style it that it becomes more aesthetic? This includes branding. So the first pillar is really about the entire central experience of a product, of an object, of an interface. And then the second pillar is human centered. In industrial design, the human is at the heart of everything. It's not the technology or the business, it's the person, the end user. This is also another key differentiator to engineers. I mean, they also do think about the person that's going to use the product, but in a much more technical sense, like how strong does the button have to resist the force for it to be comfortable potentially, or where are the screws that they can be reached? How can this all be assembled, right? So this is not talking about that kind of human centeredness that I'm speaking about here. This is really about the end user. And one quote that I really love in this context is from Raymond Loewy, where he mentioned that The designers are the knight of good taste and defenders of nerves, right? That's their job. They have to make sure that throughout the entire product development process, the end user is being respected and considered. They have to defend the nerves of the end user and have to make sure that they will be happy in the end, right? So that's also the role that I understand myself in as an industrial designer, that I have to be the voice of the user that cannot express themselves at the moment. So I have to really understand the user before I can even design for them. So the key questions for the second pillar are, what are the user needs? Like really, like at the core, what do they need? What do they want? What is the user experience? How do they experience the use of the product? And what can we do to improve that experience or to add nuances to those people's experiences, right? And also, what is the user context? So a product is always to be understood in its context of use. It doesn't help to look at, like, I don't know, an object and it works fine in like in the desert, but it's actually being used in the ice of the Antarctic, and there the material suddenly falls apart, right? So a product is always to be understood in this context and the user at the same time. So who is using it where? Those are the questions that we have to respond to as industrial designers. And that is also why it basically gives us this approach, these steps that we have to undertake to fulfill this pillar, this requirement of human-centeredness, right? We have to start with the research to deeply understand the user and the people this product is for. Then we go to the ideation and try to come up with creative and original ideas to serve those people that we identified. And then we go into the round to validate together with the user if they feel like their needs were being met, that the product does respond to the experience that they expect and that they want to experience. So human-centeredness is really about like having empathy for the user, creating a holistic view and not just the object, the physical object, or just the appearance. And they also usually say that human-centered does not mean you design for the user, but you design with the user. So ideally, you can, at every stage of the process, you have users with you that can verify and validate the idea output and that can give you pointers in the right directions of how to make this fit like exactly. Also part of this pillar, I would say, is human factors and ergonomics. People have to be able to use the thing. So we have to make sure that we design it so that it fits in their hands comfortably, that they can actually apply the force in the right way without it hurting. Pillar number 3, functionality. All right. So true functionality balances technical performance, usability, and reliability. And here I just quote Louis Sullivan with the well-known phrase, form follows function, right? So function is really the huge determinant of the product appearance. It's key. It's the one thing that adds value. It's the thing that the people buy stuff for in the first level of desire and needs, right? At first they look, okay, I need something that gives me light. And only then they go into the sublayers of, okay, these 3 objects all provide light, and I choose the one that pleases me most aesthetically and experience-wise. But the first thing is the functionality. If that doesn't work, then you're out of the race, basically. As an example, I chose the picture of this chair here because the chair looks like it does for a reason, right? Because the human body is shaped in a certain way that we want to be upright, but give our legs some rest. So we have to have an elevated platform so our legs can actually rest, but we also want to support the back so we can actually take a rest again, right? So all these things, they are there for the reason of providing the functionality that we want to embed into the object. So the key question here is, what is the intended purpose? I think this also speaks largely to engineering, right? This is really at the fundamental, at the start, at the basics of every product and object. What is the intended purpose and how can we realize it in the most effective, efficient way? This is also about like having every feature mean something. Everything needs to have a clear reason to exist, right? We don't just want to add things for decoration, but they have to have a purpose. And we know now, after years of applying these principles in design, that simplicity enhances usability. So if we strip everything away, it becomes also more easy to use an object, because it's much more clear what each function does, or where I can apply each function at. Good function means not that it works just once, but that it forms consistently and safely, that we can use it without fear of having our fingers torn apart or anything breaking, any danger to me or my surrounding. So this is the baseline, right? That we have to make sure it works. Pillar 4 is manufacturability, right? A design isn't complete until you can actually make it in scale. So the quote that I chose for this pillar is from Viktor Papanek, and it says that design must stop producing throwaway objects and produce only well-made things. So this also shows that there's like a certain responsibility we have as industrial designers to create things that are actually relevant for the world, and not just anything like the next, I don't know what you have. There are like 5 million different chairs. Do we need the 5 million and first version of the same object? And I'm not saying that no, we don't need it. I think there's valid reasons for many variations to have, especially because now, as we evolve also technologically, the objects become much more individual and specific to the end user, and not to a larger user group. Like there's now saddles for your bicycle that are based on scans of your body, or also hand grips or shoes, right? So it's really hyper individual. So you could potentially say that each of these objects now is unique, but it also is not a throwaway object, because the end user that it is being made for also uses exactly this object, and it's perfect for that person, right? The key questions that we have to ask ourselves in terms of manufacturability is, how can something be made on scale, and not just like for a certain prototype, but on large scale, if that's the purpose. But for now, that usually is the purpose still. And how can it be made cost effective, right? It's always about cost, bringing down the cost, finding the right manufacturing techniques that give me the best cost to quality ratio. And how can it be made sustainably? And with that, I mean sustainably also in the sense that long term, but also sustainably in the sense that we understand sustainability nowadays, right? For the environment. Are there ways that we can make sure that this is environmentally consciously manufactured? And especially with the young workforce that is entering industrial design year by year, I see that they have a much stronger opinion on sustainability, and a higher demand to seek options and alternatives that are more sustainable than the ones that have been used for the past 15 years or so. So I think that's really nice to see that also the companies have to be forced to think more sustainably. The content of this pillar are like designing for manufacturer, like DFM, which is like a complete branch of design, right? And it's highly relevant also for engineers. So this is also where the roles of the design industrial designer and the design engineer, or the engineer, technical engineer, mechanical engineer, overlap. But as an industrial designer, it's highly valuable to be aware of these things and also know the fundamentals of these branches of design, so the collaboration between engineering and design can work like effectively. And obviously every person, every company really loves to have an industrial designer that can provide aesthetic value, human-centered thinking, but can also technically implement function and make sure that things are manufacturable in the broader sense, cost-saving sense. What kind of tooling are we using? What kind of materials suit this project? How is the assembly assured to be manageable, as little parts as possible? So apparently Dyson is using like a single housing to reduce all the elements of the assembly. So you only have, let's say, 2 or 3 big parts that are more complex in itself, but they guarantee structural integrity either way, and they make assembly much more easy, therefore require much less time to build. Other things that you have to consider here are tolerances and precision, the overall product life cycle. So you also have to think about, okay, this is how we produce a product. this is how the user will use it. But what happens after the end of life of the product, when the user cannot use it anymore, when things are broken? What happens after? Is it being recyclable? Is it possible to take things apart and basically give new life to a product by just replacing certain components? You have to consider also the end of life. Manufacturability is something I think that is also key for industrial designers, and that often is also a little bit more difficult for the creative minded industrial designers. I would say if that's something you're really interested about, just let me know in the comments, and I plan to post specific videos just on different manufacturing techniques that are being most commonly used in the field of industrial design. So if you're curious about those, also you can just subscribe, right, so you don't miss it. But let's continue with the last pillar number 5, which is design thinking, right? And design thinking is a systematic problem-solving methodology for innovating, right? The quote that I have here is from, I think it's from the CEO of IDEO, the design company, right? Design thinking is a human-centered approach to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. So you have to be considerate of all these factors, the user, but also the technology of the time and the business case. Like, does it actually create a profitable solution, a viable solution for a business? The key questions that we have to ask ourselves for this pillar are: what is the problem? Who has the problem? And how can we solve the problem, right? This also goes along with the product development process in a general sense, right? We always have to start with research to make sure that we ask the right question, find and define our problem ideally, so we can solve it more easily and we can iterate and innovate quickly. Design thinking is a flexible approach because with the tools industrial designers have at hand, they can navigate any type of problem they are faced with, no matter the complexity, right? So design thinking also allows us to really solve complex problems by splitting things into smaller problems and putting things together again by applying all the different techniques and other methods that we have, right? It's highly solution oriented, and it's not only about an object, but applied even more so for systems, services, and experience. And it will lead to effective innovation that can be applied systematically and strategically and reliably, repeated over and over again. We can always iterate through the process to come up with the next solution and a better solution and a better solution. So these were the 5 pillars of industrial design that really cover all the fundamentals that you as an industrial designer need to fulfill in order to be able to design valuable products that help the end user and are also interesting for the industry and the business, right? So I hope by thinking about these 5 different pillars, you can also elevate your own design game and create objects and products that have aesthetic value, right? That have the human at its core, that function well, reliably, and safe, that can be made on scale, cost effectively, and that consider all the design thinking practices that we use to innovate effectively. All right, that was it. I hope you enjoyed it. See you around. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.